Today I'm making pants. This is a pants pattern that I first drafted back in 2019 into 2020. I made several versions, but I have since discovered, like many others, a fondness for a wider leg. So I'm going to make a new version that starts widening along the thigh and then continues down to the ankle. I'm using a old duvet cover, IKEA, but it's more sheer than I would want a pair of pants to be, so I'm going to line it with a white sheet that I found at Savers. Of course, the first thing to any sewing project is to press your fabric, so that's what I'm doing. This has already been washed and dried. Shall we? I started with the front piece of my existing pants pattern, which tapers in slightly at the ankle. I straightened out the side seam, adding a couple inches at the ankle. For the inseam, I drew a line a couple inches wider than the original pattern and perpendicular to the hem until it hit the crotch curve of the old pattern. I then traced the rest of the old pattern. For the back pattern piece, I again started with the old pattern piece, but this time I used the new front piece to trace my side seam and inseam. I maybe should have admitted this before that explanation, but I don't actually know what I'm doing here. I mean, I kind of do, but my professional training consists of 18 hours of continuing ed at RISD. I've been experimenting for a decade, and now I'm putting that experimentation on YouTube. You get what you pay for. I cut out the front and back pattern pieces in the main fabric and in the white lining, so I had a total of 8 pieces. Often when we're lining something, we sew all the main pieces together and then separately sew all the lining pieces together and then attach the lining to the main. The advantage of this is that all the raw edges of those seams are neatly tucked away. On pants, however, I think this sucks. It gets misaligned and bunchy, not for me. So instead, I'm sewing each lining piece to each main piece before I assemble. I'll have to finish my raw edges, but it should feel more like one piece of fabric and be a smoother, more pleasant fit. I already ironed all my fabric, but you know I'm going back to the ironing board as I pin my lining to my main piece to make sure that they are laying perfectly flat before I sew them together. Once sewn, I'll have 4 total pieces, 2 front and 2 back, each orange on one side and white on the other. The lining of the pockets have this little piece that folds over, which needs to be interfaced. This gets sewn to the main front piece with wrong sides facing, and the fold over piece folds over the main front. The backing then gets sewn to the lining along the curved edge, and the whole thing gets secured with a few stitches at the waist and side seam to make sure it'll lay flat when the rest of the piece is assembled. I'm using flat felt seams along the side seams and crotch for extra durability and for a slightly more utilitarian look. To do this, I sew the seams together, wrong sides facing. Then I carefully trimmed away just one side of seam allowance, about 1/8 of an inch from the stitch line. At the ironing board, I press both seam allowances toward the trim one. I use my hands to carefully fold over the untrimmed seam allowance, hiding all those raw edges. I pressed this in place and then top stitched it down. The waistband is 2 fat rectangles. One is as long as the waist on my back pattern piece, and the other is as long as the waist on my front pattern piece. I sewed these 2 pieces together to make a big tube, then sewed that tube to my pants, right sides facing. I folded that over and pressed it nice and neat before top stitching 3/8 of an inch from the fold all the way around. I then sewed 3/8 of an inch from the waist seam line almost all the way around, leaving just enough of a gap to insert the elastic. I hemmed the whole thing and voila! Lined duvet sheet pants.